Sure. Hello, everyone. TESOL International Association's Applied Linguistics Intersection is pleased to present this very first webinar in our new series, TQ Authors Present, or TQ Authors Talk, sorry. Our speakers today are John Levis, Taylor Ann Berriuso, Sinem Sonset, and Stephanie Link. My name is Ben White. I'm with the Applied Linguistics Intersection, and I'll be serving or attempting to serve as the moderator today. Today's presentation will last 60 minutes and include a question and answer period at the end. So during the initial presentation, if you wish to submit questions, you can do that through the chat box function at the top right of your screen where you see a little cartoon bubble. Go ahead and type your question and then hit send. I'll try to monitor these as our speakers go on through the slideshow. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to them. John, Taylor, Sinem, and Stephanie, thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Our webinar is based on our TESOL quarterly paper that was published in 2016 on native and non-native teachers of L2 pronunciation, effects on learner performance. And we're going to go through and we'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll do a presentation of what that paper was about. And we'll do that in probably about 20, maybe 25 minutes. And then we'll make some comments and we'll open it up for questions to everyone else at that point. Okay. So we'll start here, and Taylor Ann, you want to?
Sure.
Okay.
So we thought we start by telling y'all how this project came to be. And so it actually started in the fall of 2012. I was a junior in college, and I had the great fortune of working with John Levis as his undergraduate research assistant. So at that point, we had just presented the first study we'd worked on together at the Pronunciation and Second Language Learning and Teaching Conference, and I was very pumped up about research and how fun it was. And so I was like, okay, what's next? And John told me that he had 3 ideas for new studies, 2 medium-sized ideas, and 1 giant one. So he said, I'm going to tell you about them, and then you tell me what you're interested in doing. So he told me about the 2 medium-sized ones, and then he kind of gave me this wary look, and he was like, okay, so here's the 3rd one. And he kind of sketched out an idea that ended up being this study. And he said, okay, so what do you want to do? And I was like, well, they all sound really interesting, but that last one, it seems like we could really do something cool with that. I figured, I had 2 more years of college, plenty of time. And spoiler alert, I was halfway through grad school by the time this was published. But I think we all had a lot of fun.
Yeah, I don't even remember what those other 2 studies are anymore that you turned down. But this was one that I had been thinking about for years, but it was a large study to do because of having multiple people involved and teaching courses. So when Taylor Ann asked for it, we tried to figure out how to make it work. Okay, so then Sinem.
So when John told me about this project after he talked to Taylor Ann, I was very excited, but at the same time, I was really nervous because he just told me about this big idea that we were going to teach pronunciation class. And I never did that before. I knew that I was going to do pronunciation research for my PhD, but I never taught it. And then he told me that there was going to be a native English speaking teacher and a non-native English speaking teacher. I was invited to teach as a non-native English speaking teacher. And I said, okay, what if my students don't make progress? Will I be able to teach pronunciation? But then it was such a great idea, and I just, okay, I'm gonna do it and I'll do my best. And it was a fantastic thing to do. I'm so happy that I was part of it.
And so my turn. So First off, my name is Stephanie Link. I'm an assistant professor at Oklahoma State University, where I teach in our T-cell and applied linguistics program. But at the time of this study, I was a PhD student, and I was pretty new in the program, again, like 2012, 2013. And I had recently graduated from a program in Taiwan at Tom Kang University. And I remember when I was studying there, I had this feeling that a lot of my classmates, who were all non-native, very competent teachers, were consistently asking me about my knowledge in the field. And of course, I was equal to them. But what was the outlier was that I was a native speaker. And I thought, something strange is going on here. What is going on? How can we delve into this problem? So I ended up, when I went to Iowa State, I did do a research study in John's class about non-native faculty and their self-perception about their native speakerness. And I think that that really hooked me into this topic area. This idea of global Englishes was, an ongoing conversation. And so when they asked me, of course, I was very interested, but I was also very intrigued because if you notice, I don't know if all of you can see Sinem and I, well, you can see our picture on the slide. Sinem and I, well, so we're friends. We are very much alike in many cases, and you'll see that later in our PowerPoint presentation. But we're also, I think we would call ourselves ethnically distinct. Like if you look at us, you may not know if we're native or non-native teachers. And that was interesting to me. So of course I was like gung-ho, just like Taylor Ann. Let's go ahead, let's see what we can come up with. So I think overall with our research stories, you all see that we come from very different backgrounds. And I think that really contributed to a very fun and dynamic collaboration and a successful article. And if you haven't read this article, I did post it in the chat. And assuming that not all of you have read the article, we are going to give a short little presentation about it, starting with Taylor Ann's background of the study.
Okay, so.
Okay, so we kind of started with this background about native and non-native English speaking teachers and their feelings about teaching pronunciation. So the research had shown, and anecdotally, we'd seen that many native English speaking teachers are uncomfortable teaching pronunciation for a number of reasons, including that oftentimes in ESL training, there's not a lot of specific training on pronunciation. Additionally, especially at the time, there weren't maybe a ton of materials for pronunciation teaching. Sometimes native teachers had difficulty perceiving sounds, or there were issues in assessing and monitoring. And although the research seemed to be showing that suprasegmentals play a particular role in comprehensibility, especially oftentimes teachers feel uncomfortable doing that. So in addition to these kind of concerns for native speaker teachers, non-native English speaking teachers may have even increased concerns. So often there's a lack of confidence in their ability to be a pronunciation model. Often they might have limited commands of phonological features, or at least believe that they do. And of course, there's that concern about the non-native accent. So despite these feelings, there wasn't any known research at the time on whether learners' pronunciation skills were able to improve, or if they improved differentially with native versus non-native teachers. So we went into this study with a couple of main purposes. So first, we wanted to know the effects of teaching pronunciation on accentedness and comprehensibility, and whether those differed in depending on teachers' language background, so whether they were native or non-native, and then also to challenge these beliefs about non-native English-speaking teachers being inadequate. Okay, this looks a little funky, but we knew at the time and have seen kind of more evidence come out since then that pronunciation instruction does seem to be effective. So a couple of meta-analyses were published in 2015 of 86 pronunciation training studies that demonstrated both that pronunciation instruction almost always resulted in improvement, and that in fact there was a large effect size. So the Thompson and Derwing study in 2015 was more of a narrative analysis, and they found that most studies focused on accuracy, but not necessarily intelligibility, and that often these studies were focusing on segmentals rather than suprasegmentals, despite what we know about suprasegmental contribution to comprehensibility and intelligibility. And also, these studies didn't really say anything about the native or non-native status of the teachers. So despite the fact that we didn't know any research about the differences between the effect of teachers' language background and pronunciation instruction, a number of studies have developed a kind of dichotomy between native English-speaking teachers versus non-native English-speaking teachers. In our paper, we refer to these as NEST and N-NEST. And so what these studies have shown is that the native speaking teachers are considered to be effective because of their English proficiency and possibly their ability to facilitate students' learning, whereas the N-NEST non-native teachers have other strengths, such as their knowledge of students' L1 potentially, and their understanding of the second language learners' difficulties. So it appeared that in a variety of studies that students preferred non-native or native speaking teachers to non-native speaking teachers, specifically for pronunciation. This wasn't always the case for other skills such as grammar. But no studies tested whether these native speaking teachers were more effective, specifically with regard to oral skills.
So in line with our motivation and the background Taylor Ann shared, we had two research questions. The first one was, how similar are raters' judgments of students' accentedness and comprehensibility in classes taught by me and Stephanie? And how do students evaluate our teaching's effectiveness as pronunciation teachers? The pronunciation class, we both taught 7 weeks for 7 weeks, and then we used materials developed by John and his co-author, and the book is called Pronunciation for a Purpose. And as you can see in the table, I had 8 learners in my class and Stephanie had 10 learners. And it is important to remind that we wanted to keep we wanted to match our students in the class, so we looked at their language backgrounds and everything. But then some students dropped off, so I ended up with 8 learners. Stephanie's class ended up with 10 learners. So we met students 2 times a week, and we taught them for 1.5 hours, and we focused on suprasegmental features in pronunciation. Specifically, if you look at our teaching sequence, we started with prominence, and we went on with fluency, phonetic symbols, thought groups, word stress, phrase rhythm, and intonation. And our goal was basically to help them to be communicative speakers. Okay, so we both taught the same materials every day when we met our groups. And then every week, John, Stephanie, and I met just to make sure that we were covering the same things in similar fashions. And then John recorded our teaching 2 times, and he also observed our classes just to make sure things were going similar. And then at the end of our teaching, students in our classes completed a survey evaluating our teaching. And we never hid our personality IDs from the students, but if they ever asked us who we were, we just told them who we were, but we never emphasized our being a native or non-native English speaking teacher. If you look at the similarities between me and Stephanie, as she said, we're actually really similar. We're close friends in the first place. And then we both were PhD students in the same program, Applied Linguistics and Technology. So we had similar teaching experience. We taught the same classes, similar classes as part of our TA assignments. And then we had similar knowledge of language theories and subject matters since we were in the same program. And the only difference is I'm a non-native English speaker from Turkey, and Stephanie is from the US. But one thing important in this table that you're seeing right now is the comprehensibility and accentedness ratings Stephanie and I had by the raters. So we had a scale, a 9-point scale. On these scales, 1 is extremely easy to understand for comprehensibility, and 9 is very difficult to understand. And again, for accentedness, 1 is no foreign accent, 9 is strong accent. So if you look at our scores, raters evaluated Stephanie and they gave her 1, and for both comprehensibility and accentedness, showing clearly that they can tell she's a native speaker. And then they evaluated me for comprehensibility 2 and then accentedness 3. So our scores are close, but also the difference shows that they can tell the difference between the native and non-native English speaking teacher. And if we talk about the students, they were all affiliated with Iowa State University, where we did the research study. Some of them were not students. They were spouses of the grad students, or they were visiting scholars. And you can see the language backgrounds of our students. In my class, there were 7 Chinese students, 1 Spanish speaker. In Stephanie's class, it was a little bit more various, like she had Chinese, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, and Vietnamese speakers. Okay, so if you look at the data collection, so right before the teaching intervention, we had the pre-test, and after the teaching, we had the post-test, and during the pre and post-test, we had students read 25 sentences, and then we had them talk to John and do an interview, talk about their favorite holidays so that we could also have free speech samples. But when it came to samples that we used for data analysis, we used 4 pre-test sentences, 4 post-test sentences for each student. And we also had sentences by native and non-native distractors in the group. We also had post interviews with the students to understand what their experience were like with me and with Stephanie in class. So we had 33 native speaker undergraduate students from Iowa State again. They were either beginning linguistics students or they were taking the writing or composition classes. They were naive raters. They rated the comprehensibility and accentedness of us, of the speakers, our participants, and also the distractors. And the rating procedure, we used the 9-point scales for both comprehensibility and accentedness. This is actually something that is used quite often, as you might all know, in comprehensibility and accentedness rating. So again, 1 represented the good end of the scale, 9 represented the impossible to understand or very strong foreign accent end of the scales. So we shared the speech samples of the students on Moodle, and we had a random block design. So they were listening to the speakers and distractors in random order. And additional data collection processes, we had post-test questionnaires, and we had 8 Likert scale items. So we asked for students' ratings of the class and of us. And then we had the interviews, as we said before, and in those we had 12 semi-structured questions. We asked them how they perceived their experience with me and with Stephanie, how the class went for them, and what they thought about us in general. And then for the analysis, for research question 1, where we wanted to see if they evaluated our students differently for their comprehensibility and accentedness, we used two-way ANOVA, descriptive statistics. And then for research question 2, we used frequency counts and inductive coding because we were looking at the qualitative part of the data.
So I hope that you see from Sinam's description the meticulous detail that we put into this design. I remember that we would sit in that exact office where John is right now and plan out this design, making sure that it was sound, it was rigorous, and we were controlling as much as possible for, a classroom-based study, controlling as much as possible for those intervening variables to ensure that the teacher's language background was that outlier, that variable that we were investigating. So whenever you put, your heart and soul into a methodology, you expect, these amazing results. We do feel like we got the results that we, can stand behind. But the truth of the matter is, when we look at this slide here, we expected improvement and we did not see improvement when it comes to the pre-test and post-test. So all students together, their improvement from beginning and end of the course in terms of read speech and spontaneous speech for accentedness and comprehensibility, there was not improvement. But go to the next slide, you can see that interestingly, there was also not improvement based off of the teacher's language background. So you see here that there was a statistically significant difference between accentedness. Well, when we're really trying to make claims about the student's performance or difference in performance from the variable being language background, we would hope that the difference would be seen in comprehensibility. That's what means more to indicate improvement to pronunciation, but we only saw it in accentedness. Of course, there was some suspicion that something was going on, so we looked at the individual level. And at the individual level, I'm sorry about the formatting about this, but this is the figure that you'll see in our paper. And there were consistently 5 students that always improved in all aspects. That means they consistently improved for read and spontaneous speech, as well as for accentedness and comprehensibility. The other students in the classes showed mixed improvement. So some of them would improve in accentedness, but not comprehensibility, some in comprehensibility, but not accentedness, or some didn't show improvement. So we were seeing improvement or glimpses of improvement at the individual level. So what does this say? This says that it seemed that there was no difference in students' performance based off of the teacher's language background. But then we went into perception, which I think is a really interesting part of our study. Sinam said we gave them post questionnaires where here's some of the data. The paper has a little bit more of the results. But you'll see that the students, for example, the quality of the teacher and the course, like spot on. High five to Sinam and I, right? High quality classes. The instructors presented the subject matter effectively, also high quality and very equal. And the last one, I am glad I had the opportunity to study with this teacher, also very high quality. So you can see the students were rating us very equally. In addition, they rated us very equally in terms of our personality characteristics. So I had mentioned earlier that not only are we like ethnically distinct, but we have very similar personalities. I think that's why we are so cohesive in terms of our friendship, right? So friendly or unfriendly or very friendly, we were, consistently very friendly, energetic, enthusiastic, approachable, organized, surprisingly. But the students viewed us very similarly in terms of all of these teacher characteristics. However, when we asked these students about their perception towards a native teacher, not like us in particular, native teacher versus a non-native teacher for teaching different skills, they were fine, sometimes hesitant about grammar and reading, which if you look into the literature, that is pretty consistent. But for speaking, they were a little bit on edge, and for pronunciation, take a look at that table. It says, yes, it would matter for the teacher to be a native teacher, 12 of them. The majority of them still prefer to have a native teacher. It wouldn't matter. There's only 2, and it kind of depends. They said 3. So if you remember when we saw in the effectiveness, there was really no difference in the performance of students based on teacher background, language background. The students rated us as high quality, yet they still preferred the native teacher. So John's going to talk about what that all means in the grand scheme of our field.
So we'll do a quick discussion. If you want more, the paper has much more extensive. One of the things that we came up with in this study is that the native language background of the teacher didn't make a difference. And this was very important, even though we had less improvement than we had hoped for. We had hoped to see it for both classes, and we didn't, but we didn't see any difference between the 2 classes and the way the students rated the teachers. And that was important because we often hear these questions or these issues of people saying that non-native teachers are not good for pronunciation or they're not effective. And we didn't see that at all. The lack of improvement that we saw may reflect the task of reading aloud especially, or the lack of outside practice for many of the students. We did set up outside practice for them, but we found that they actually didn't do it very much. There was a small group that consistently practiced outside of class, but most of them did not. And then finally, the last piece that Steph just talked about, there's strong student beliefs to accepting NS teachers, even though the evidence suggests that native language status makes no difference. And that was part of the reason that we did this study in the beginning. I've taught pronunciation and trained pronunciation teachers for many years, and I have never seen any evidence that being a non-native teacher makes you less effective as a pronunciation teacher. But many of the non-native teachers that I have had in my classes have felt that uneasiness. And I think from the perspective of the research we did, we see that the students in the classes think that a native speaker will be better, as though somehow they're going to be able to catch the accent just from being around a native speaker. But none of the evidence in how the students rated the teacher's effectiveness or in the way that they improved says that there is any difference between the 2. So Steph, you can come back in on this one as well. We're going to open it up and just tell some things that we learned from the study, and then open it up for questions. So we have 3 questions here. What did we learn from the study? Were there any surprises? And what would we change if we did the study again? Does anybody want to make a comment here?
Okay, I can get started with the first question. I think the first thing that I learned from this study is that I could teach pronunciation as a non-native English speaking teacher. And I think because of this study, I have more confidence now, and that really helped me. I wasn't surprised that I could do it. With your support, it was easier than I expected, but I saw that there's no reason for non-native English speaking teachers to be afraid of pronunciation teaching.
Yeah, for me, I feel like this whole study helped me understand the importance of intentionality. So I knew my flaws as a teacher, And so going into the classroom, that was very much in the back of my head. You know, what do I need to do to make sure that I'm not conflicting the study design? You know, I'm not doing anything that I wouldn't normally do. But at the same time, I was very cautious of knowing what I couldn't do and what I needed to improve on. So once I taught the class, which similar to CNM, I had never taught a pronunciation class before. I had taught conversational speaking classes, but pronunciation I had not. I took the class with John and we got some training, and that was about it. So I knew that after I taught the class and I had this, you know, perception of what I was like as a teacher, I needed to go out and be more intentional with my personal training, my personal professional development. And so that's me as a native speaker thinking that I didn't have all of the skills I needed to become that ultimate teacher that I wanted to be. And so when you think of that, maybe from a native or non-native background, we have these flaws. We all have potentially low areas of confidence. Some things we're more confident than others, but we need to understand those and be intentional in how we can become better in those areas. And that's definitely what I learned from this study.
I learned mostly that it's worth trying to do things that are hard to do. The training studies, are, especially a classroom training study, are always problematic because teachers are different. And if you're dealing with native and non-native teachers, you can't have the same person teaching both classes. But it worked. Could it have worked better? Probably. But the having evidence that you can point to that says that non-native teachers and native teachers in this area, the area that native teachers seem to be given a pass on unfairly, while non-native teachers often feel uneasy about teaching it. I like having evidence that we can point to that says, no, that this is not an issue. It's an issue of, are you good teachers? Are you trained to teach? And that non-native teachers should not be afraid of this area. Okay. Any other comments from either of you?
Yeah, I think you made a good point. What I also noticed is that it was all about being prepared to teach, because like if you don't know what you're doing, that would be very hard. And I think that's the part maybe that scares people when it comes to pronunciation teaching. So you need to be prepared. That's the most important thing.
Yes, and that was always an interesting difference between the two of you as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important point. I don't know if this is in our other article, but our amount of preparation was very different. So not necessarily amount, but like the way we're prepared. So CNM would take these very detailed notes next to every little activity.
Mm-hmm.
And so her approach was very, I don't know if you would say like maybe bottom up. You were looking at those details to make sure that you were able to predict the overall idea.
I think for me, part of it was like, because I knew I didn't have the native speaker intuitions, like if there's any word, let's say whose word stress I didn't know, or something that I didn't know, that made me a little bit uncomfortable. And remember, John, I looked at every single note that you put into the teacher's manual. There was one time that I listened to this exercise, remember? You all remember probably. And I listened to the intonation practice, I guess this was, and I marked the answers that I had based on my own listening. And then I looked at the answer key, nothing matched. And I was so frustrated. I said, if I cannot hear myself, how can I go to the class and teach this? And I talked to Stephanie about this, and I went ahead and talked to John, and they both said, oh, the answer key is wrong. I'm like, okay, but my tendency was to trust the answer key first, because the answer key was prepared by a native speaking author. So I think
Who
I
couldn't
gained a
type?
little bit more confidence in that, like that I can rely on my listening too. So that was funny experience for me.
Right, and one of the things that did come out of this is CNM's research on the importance of teacher guides,
Oh yeah.
because I had written much of that teacher's guide, and I thought I was being explicit, but I was never explicit. CNM would say, "What does this mean?" And I say, "It's what it says." And she said, "No, it's not what it says. It's not enough for a non-native
Yeah.
teacher." But then I came to realize it really wasn't enough for a native teacher. It was only enough for me, and I already knew the answers.
I remember a particular instance about that. So remember you explained something about a cultural thing, and then you said some of the non-native speakers may not understand this. And I went to John's office and I said, I'm one of those non-native speakers. What do you really mean? I don't have the cultural background for that. So I'm like, could you please say what it means in the teacher's manual?
Right. Yeah, and it teachers' manuals often get put to the side as things that you have to do, but you don't really get any credit for. But it becomes important when you're addressing teachers who don't have a lot of confidence in teaching pronunciation, or maybe have never had any training in it. And this is not a native, non-native issue. It's simply teachers. You need to give them enough information that they can understand without having to go back and take a class in it. So what would we change if we did the study again?
Make the teaching part longer.
Make the teaching part longer? Make Taylor Ann teach one?
Yeah, I think it's evident that we would need, more students, a longer amount of time. I think something we didn't point out that I think is unique of the study is making sure that our raters were novice listeners. They came from, John, was it your class, your linguistics class, and some other undergraduate classes? So
I think so, yeah.
They were more naive, so they didn't necessarily perceive speech from a very informed pronunciation linguistics standpoint.
Right, we picked them for their native intuitions and their lack of extensive training in looking at language.
Yeah.
I think it might also be interesting. I mean, if we ever did this again, I know it's hard to find the teachers, but it would be interesting to see what happens if we have, let's say, 3 native English speaking teachers, 3 non-native, because we know Steph and I are very similar in our like educational background and everything. So what would happen if we don't really control those variables? Would it mean that any native English speaking teacher is fine with pronunciation teaching, or are all non-native English speaking teachers fine too? Would we find any different result? I don't know.
Yeah,
We might. You were both relatively inexperienced, but you had training, and we have had objections through the years of people saying, well, CNM was a non-native teacher, but she's good. What about non-native teachers who aren't so good? And we don't know, but I do know from doing tutoring practica that often non-native teachers who feel mildly uncomfortable in what they're teaching come up with really creative strategies to tutor L2 learners. And sometimes they take themselves out of teacher mode and become a co-learner, and it's incredibly effective, so that they're not trying to pretend that they are somehow an expert, but they turn it around and work alongside the learner in terms of learning particular contrasts. So I think if I did the study again, I would want to build in more effective outside of class practice that we could focus some attention on, because I think that really did hold some people back.
And we did collect some data on teacher cognition, but we didn't really report on that in this paper. And I think that teacher cognition is so important, especially when you have those teachers that are not confident. We need to know when their confidence is breaking down so we can provide effective strategies to help them compensate for their uncertainties. So teacher cognition studies where we follow teachers, they do simulated recalls. We are following during their planning process so that when they do have questions, like Sinem said, she had this question about an answer that actually she was completely correct about, but instead went on that whole week really stressing about it. Those insights, I think, would be very informative for all teachers, native and non-native.
Hey, so let's go to the last slide here, and this is how do we feel about how this area of research has changed since we did the study. And what we're really talking about here is nest and nest issues. Pronunciation just happens to be a good place to expose some of the inequities that we all deal with as being native teachers or non-native teachers. So any comments here?
And it looks like we
do you have any?
I think in general, pronunciation area is doing a good job about showing it doesn't really matter whether your teacher is a native or non-native, but I would say my personal experience in the EFL setting right now, since I work in Turkey, I still can see that even the professionals, like practitioners, they have the perception that it has to be native English speaking teachers when it comes to pronunciation, or sometimes I feel they assume everything will work fine as long as the teacher is a native English speaking teacher. Because on one particular instance, I had asked people what they did about their oral communication or pronunciation classes in an English prep program, and they said, oh, that's fine, we have native English speaking teachers. So they didn't talk about their curriculum, they didn't talk about their materials or anything, they just gave the answer of having a native English speaking teacher, which took care of everything. So I don't know if the changes are equal in EFL and ESL settings in that sense. It may depend on people's following research or their personal opinions in spite of the research findings.
Steph, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts are that it's so frustrating. This whole fallacy. I mean, we've just shown that it doesn't matter. Yes, Sinem is highly qualified. I mean, now more than at that point. At that point, we were both learning about pronunciation. Unfortunately, we had a class, and there's somebody that asked, you know, what about native teachers or even non-native teachers who are not qualified? If the field has changed, because I feel like we are acknowledging the fact that training in these specific areas are more necessary than general. Like in general, let's teach about speaking. Well, speaking can be broken down even further, and those meticulous skills like pronunciation is not something that, for me, I would not feel comfortable of going into that classroom without proper training. I don't know if I would have been able to teach that class without proper training, but I did seek out that training. John's class was an elective at that time. My area was not pronunciation. My area is actually language and technology. But again, with intentionality, I knew that I needed to take that class, and I did. And so other people who don't feel qualified would need to do something similar. Programs that are offering like TESOL programs or applied linguistics programs need to consider how are they training their teachers in these more specialized skill areas. And I feel, especially since pronunciation field has come quite far since we wrote this paper, especially with the start of the pronunciation journal plug-in for John and CNM. But a lot more research is being produced, and it's focused research. And because of that, we are making large strides. But the whole, again, going back to my initial comment, the fallacy is so frustrating. And if we can really get into teachers' minds to break down this fallacy from the teachers, then maybe we can influence the students. I don't know if it's vice versa, if that can happen, if we can go to the students and break down the fallacy, or where the breakdown needs to happen. But I feel like it's coming, even though it's been years since native speaker fallacies have been under discussion.
So at this point, we'll open it up for questions for the people who are listening to us. And Ben, you've been monitoring the chat box, and so you
Yes,
can
I have.
raise any of the questions that you think would be most interesting.
Okay, I will try my best. And as we transition to question time, I'd just like to commend our presenters on a rigorous and thoughtful study that does tackle this pervasive and pernicious nativeness principle, which sadly affects language teaching and the field of SLA equally in a detrimental way. With that, I have been monitoring some of the questions, and one interesting one that just came up, we've been talking a lot about native speaking teachers versus non-native speaking teachers, but someone commented on a study that they carried out with prestige dialect versus non-prestige dialects, finding a similar result with students' attitudes. And I think the larger question is, how do we change students' minds?
That's hard because it goes for a long time. It's been there throughout all of their learning. And when you're talking about prestige and non-prestige dialects, I don't know what the two dialects are here, but English pronunciation issues in terms of prestige usually have to do with dialects that don't have anything in them that you can make fun of. So a prestige dialect like General American or RP are considered the kind of base of good English of that variety. And if you have a dialect that violates certain things that are expected, like for British English, if you have a Scottish accent and you have particular things like maybe a different type of R, or American English, if you have Southern US English with making I vowels into ah, they get marked, and I don't know that students often notice these as much as we do as teachers. So maybe we need to just say that nativeness and dialect differences are as varied as non-nativeness, and you can only model the dialect that you speak, and you can accept any other types of variety that is acceptable for communication. And ultimately, dialect questions are an issue of native privilege, not of whether you're intelligible or not.
So speaking of changing students' minds, a response to that question was the possibility of schools changing the way they market and recruit. And I presume that means trying to get teachers that represent different dialects, both native speaking and non-native speaking. Because I think, as your study shows, right, that as students are exposed to a teacher through a very carefully organized class, that they will there will be an impact there, a positive one. So maybe there's something about exposure here. There's a question from Argentina asking about how we assess future teachers' pronunciation. Or if you'd like to tackle that.
Sinem, you're the one doing assessment these days.
I would say assessment is the hardest part of pronunciation. I don't know if you guys would agree or not, but I've been teaching pronunciation in Turkey for the last 2 semesters, and it's been the hardest part. I would say assessment is not something that a lot of people will be willing to do, but if you need to do it, it should start with like self-assessment, so people know what it means to assess pronunciation. Because before you assess your own pronunciation, it's almost impossible to know how you're going to assess somebody else's. But I would say mostly people tend to assess teachers or somebody else's segmentals because it seems like the easiest to assess to people. But they need to learn how to assess, how to collect data to assess people's suprasegmental features like intonation and word stress. And yet those are the ones that teachers mostly stay away from based on my own dissertation. So assessment is a whole different story, I would say. You really need to have training to know how to assess pronunciation. Because, I mean, if you don't want to focus on only the TH sounds of people.
Yeah.
And not to add to the complexity of this, but assessment tends to be context specific, right? So if you're drawing on what John was saying about dialect variations and perceptions towards dialects, if you're here like in Oklahoma, what we hope that our students would be able, or how our students would be able to perform might be very different than if I'm back in my alma mater in Taiwan, and what I expect those students to do in terms of their performance. The region that you're at is going to influence what you're looking at or what you expect from your students. But I think we all agree that that native speaker gold standard is not what we advocate. We're advocating for this world English, this global English perspective, where it's not based off of your native speakerness, but rather your comprehensibility, intelligibility of that for that region.
And I
Right.
think that that's a very important piece. Often with pronunciation, the nativeness principle or the nativeness myth sits there hiding beneath the surface, and we don't even often know how to talk about some of the questions without comparing it to whether it's native or not. But ultimately, non-native speakers, like native speakers, have accents, and native speakers accept other accents. Some of them have a wider acceptance range than others, but as long as we can understand the person, we should be able to accept it just as they accept our accent. And so it's what's really important in terms of assessment has to do with how easy you are to understand, how intelligible or how comprehensible. And I think of, this was a questioner from Argentina, and one of the people who's part of the speech pronunciation listening intersection is Veronica Sardegna, and she's from Argentina, and she has a clear Argentinian accent in her English, but she's completely intelligible, and she should have an Argentinian accent. She's from Argentina. And we need to quit thinking that because someone is different in their accent, that therefore they are not qualified to be a teacher of this particular skill. It's just a silly way to think.
Can I add something on that? So I think one way of helping people understand that intelligibility is important, or it doesn't matter which standard you teach with or which dialect you use. Maybe something about materials, because all the textbooks, as you know, either go with like American English or British English, and that affects teachers a lot because students get to listen to those varieties only. So that might be something that material developers can change, but if it doesn't change immediately, maybe teachers may try bring in listening materials with speakers of different language backgrounds. That might also help. And the other thing that I did in my class this year, for instance, right at the beginning of my pronunciation class, I had them listen to 3 different speakers from different language backgrounds. And of course, at the beginning, they were all like, oh, it's difficult to understand this person, that person. They were just picking on this and that aspect. And then in the following week, I recorded them reading the same text. So they made a connection to those people that they listened to in the previous week. And they started to be more open to different varieties. And I make sure that I bring them speech samples from other language backgrounds. This may help them a little bit because, again, somebody in this chat box, Daniela, said intelligible to who, or whose intelligibility. That's a good point too, because I may also have my students listen to Australian English or Scottish English. They may find it equally difficult as, let's say, English of someone from a non-native English speaking background. So it's all about, I think, adaptation, listening to different varieties, not just listening to native speaker varieties.
And also to go back to El Murphy's question about marketing sales, yes, we need to change this. We have to quit putting just white males that look like native speakers on our marketing materials, because we are portraying this same sort of perspective that this native speaker, we have native speakers in our language institute, so come here because you will improve your English better than in somewhere else. No, the beauty of our field of TESOL is that we are so diverse, and we need to be bringing that throughout in our training courses, our pre-teacher training courses, all the way to the practitioners and our administrators. They need to know that this is no longer the case. If you have quality trained teachers, that should be what you are marketing, not that native speaker image, because that just hurts. I believe that hurts everybody in our field in the long run. Because we are marginalizing groups that don't need to be marginalized, that shouldn't be oppressed. We should be celebrating the diversity.
Yeah, and I think also, Steph, that you hint at this, but not all native speakers in these kinds of contexts are equal, because native speaker views also overlap with racial views. And so if you don't look like the native speaker you want to put on your marketing materials, you also are at a disadvantage. And this is not, this is crazy.
Okay.
And I think go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead, after you.
I think that native speaker policy also puts pressure on the native English speaking teachers, because I remember when I interviewed teachers for my dissertation, one of these native English speaking teachers said, so they just gave the pronunciation class to me just because I'm a native English speaking teacher. And he said, I was fine with the segmentals. When it came to super segmentals, and he said, basically what I did was I said a sentence and I told my students, this is how it is, just repeat after me. So he was so stressed out because he didn't know what to do, and he was so upset that they just, based on what he said, they just dumped on the class on him, because thinking that he's a native speaker, he would be ready to teach it, and clearly he wasn't, and he wasn't happy about it either.
I wonder if I could sneak in a methodology question right as we end here. And I was curious if you shared the ratings results with the students themselves at the end of the course.
We didn't. I think we didn't have time. Did we, Steph? Did we tell them whether they improved or not?
We didn't. I know that we did some member checks just to make sure that what they were saying in their interviews was truly aligned with what we were interpreting. But that was with the interviews and not the actual data. In fact, I think I didn't analyze the data till quite a bit
Next
down the
semester or
line.
something, right? Yeah. So the ratings that we got came quite a bit later. So we didn't have that to share with them.
Because
Well, I
remember,
was also wondering if that was an intentional decision on your part, because as you say in the paper, you went out of your way to get inexperienced raters. And maybe that's not the most helpful thing for the students themselves to see those.
so you mean sharing the results with the undergraduate raters? No,
With the students themselves.
yeah, because we had students in the classes we didn't share with them, and we had students that were rating the samples and we didn't share with them. Part of the reason we didn't share with the students who were taking the class is because the whole process of collecting the data and normalizing our speech samples, that took a lot of time, and recruiting our raters. I think it was months after actual teaching that we finally got the results to share. But it would be interesting how those results may impact perspective. They might say, oh yeah, I did say this, but I guess I would maybe change my mind.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock and it does say noon Eastern, so I think that is our cue. With that, we have to conclude today's online program. And today's presentation, again, was our first in the series, TQ Authors Talk, Native and Non-Native Teachers of L2 Pronunciation Effects on Learner Performance. I thank the presenters so much for spending an hour with us and answering some of our questions. And thank you all. That's it. I think we're going to disconnect, and this should be recorded and available through TESOL. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.